Don't worry, we're only recording those of us who are unmuted and talking. So as long as you stay muted, you will not be part of that recording. But please do use the chat box throughout the evening. If you have any questions at all, please type them in. We will be having an audience question and answer portion at the end of the evening, and Javeth and I will pose your questions for you. Type in questions at any time and we'll skip them up. And then one other note, which is a note of thanks to all of you. It is a tough time in the world of independent bookselling and really small businesses of any stripe. And we know very clearly at Northshire that the fact that we're still here to have events and to sell books is thanks to the love and dedication of our customers. We couldn't do what we're doing without all of you. So thank you to all of you for the continued love and support that we've been receiving. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Davith to introduce our special guest this evening.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Well, it is a great pleasure to once again get to welcome to Northshire, though this time virtually, Melanie Finn. I finally remember her last event in the actual store for her novel, The Underneath. She was born and raised in Kenya and the US. Her novel, The Gloaming, was a New York Times notable book of 2016, a finalist for the Vermont Book Award, and The Guardian's Not the Booker Prize. She is the writer and producer of the Disney nature wildlife epic Crimson Wing, Mystery of the Flamingos, and the co-founder and director of the Tanzanian-based charity Natron Healthcare. Her new novel is The Hare, listed as the most anticipated book of the year by Vulture, Bustle, BuzzFeed, and Elle. The Vulture review said, "This is a page-turner about a tough woman and her con artist lout of a partner, a book that is easy to read without being remotely lightweight." And the great benefit of virtual events is the triumph over geography. And we are very lucky to have joining us from England at a late hour, the novelist and journalist Tim Lott. His award-winning memoir, The Scent of Dried Roses, is a Penguin modern classic in the UK, though none of his books are available domestically, unfortunately, or we want to link up in the chat forum. So please welcome, join me in welcoming to Northshire, Tim Lott and Melanie Finn.
Hi, everybody. Hi, very nice to see you all, or see some of you. Some of you are merely black screens, but that's fine. I don't know what you're doing behind those screens. It always sets my imagination off. So it's great to be here to talk to Mel Finn, a very old friend of mine, one of the finest writers I know, and I'm always very excited when she has a new book out. And The Hare, as usual, doesn't disappoint. She's got the most remarkable prose style, and her elegance and economy always leave me gasping, usually with envy as much as anything else. I finished The Hare a little while ago. I really enjoyed it. It was quite an uncomfortable read for me as an old white male, because old white males do not come out of it very well in the book, by and large. In fact, we're all evil paedophiles, as far as I can make out. So it's probably a very different experience to read it as a man as it is for reading it as a woman, which I think is one of the interesting themes we're going to explore today, because I think we're in the middle of a cultural conversation. Certainly in this country, in England, there has just been a terrible murder of a poor innocent young woman on the streets, and that has almost set off a new Me Too movement about the violence of men and the victimization of women by men. So this feels a very timely novel, and I want to explore some of those themes with Melanie and see what she makes of them. Before I do that, though, Mel, can I ask you, why is it called The Hare?
So that's a great question, Tim. So firstly, I just wanted to thank Rachel and David for making this happen again, and you, Tim, for coming in again. And some of you may have tried this before, so I apologize for that. So The Hare, the initial title, the sort of working title, was The Giggle Man, which is, of course, the name that Rosie gives to her abuser. And Eric Obanoff, my fabulous publisher, said, no, you can't give her abuser that kind of honor. You can't make him the title of the book. So it was Eric who came up with the Hare. And I think the reason that he chose that is that the Hare is something of an icon that appears throughout the book, appears in the painting that Rosie sees in the beginning when she's with Bennett in Connecticut in the very wealthy people's house, Hobie's painting. And then she finds a hare about midway through the book under her porch, which is in fact something that I myself found under my neighbor's porch. So it's a hare that's been shot and mummified in a posture of escape. And I can't remember the exact place in the book, but she says something about it, that it's in this permanent attitude of escape and unable to move, which of course is very much like Rosie herself. And then of course, without giving too much away, the hare makes an appearance at the very end of the book.
Right, what does it represent to you though?
The hare represents to me, I think, an animal that is a prey animal, but is also gifted with the ability to, with special senses that allow it to escape from its predators.
Okay, so the book is fundamentally about Rosie, who's the protagonist, and she is the victim serially of a number of unpleasant men, starting with the Giggle Man when she's a child, and she is served up to this mysterious character in her grandmother's upper floors, and we'll come to that a bit later, because I think, as Mel has made public on a number of occasions, there's something not dissimilar happened to her as a child, and that has informed some of her creative life. But then she gets together Rosie with this guy Bennett, very glamorous, very wealthy, who dazzles her, but is a con man and violent and manipulative person, and his friend Wheezy, who is, as I remember, a drug dealer. Is that right, Mel? Was he?
Yes.
A drug dealer. And Hobie, who's Bennett's father, who comes from the real upper echelons of New England society, would you say, or is it? Have I got the region?
Yeah, Hobie's not his father, but his parents' family friend, and yes, he's from like the very upper crust, the WASP, very upper crust East Coast society.
So quite apart from the element of misogyny and violence in this, there's also a very strong element of class. What was it about class that attracted you and makes you want to write about it? Because as an Englishman, I always tend to think that's more British obsession than in America, but it's very clear from reading your book that class signaling and status signaling are just as subtle and just as powerful in America. And how do you know about that, and has it affected you, and why have you written about it?
Well, it's kind of a long question, so I'll try and come at it from two ends. So when I first started writing the book, Trump was about to be elected, and I felt as a woman, I felt very overshadowed by this powerful misogyny that was taking over and seemed to be being rewarded. Well, in fact, was rewarded. I mean, you have this lying con man, serial assaulter of women, who said things about women and women's bodies that were reprehensible, and he was being rewarded for this behavior by being voted into the most powerful position on the land. So I came to the book feeling incredibly vulnerable. At the same time, I live in an area of the Northeast Kingdom, which is, you know, hugely pro-Trump, and it's a poor area. People here, you know, this one of the poorest parts of the States, and you'd see these crumble down trailer homes with huge Trump banners and Trump flags, some of which are still there. So I was really curious to try and understand, like, what wealth represents to people who don't have it, and how it can be, how people who have money are able to manipulate the truth for those who don't have it. So, and I say this knowing that I'm possibly stepping into some kind of, you know, awful quagmire of being accused of being classist myself. Although I do reference a conversation with Tim years ago. We had an argument about my family always imagining that they were upper middle class. But when we actually went back and looked at my heritage, I realized that I'm actually totally middle class, as is Tim. So yeah, you know, there's definitely that element of class that I grew up in, but I certainly live in an area where people are very aware of who has money and who doesn't have it.
So I do have to correct you there. I'm not middle class. I don't come from the middle class, Mel.
Oh,
Unlike you, my father works in a greengrocery shop. But I should just I should continue by asking. It's a book about power then, in many ways, because it's about different forms of power, about the power that the wealthy have and how they utilize that power to exploit and deceive, and the power that men have over women. Isn't there an element of, I mean, Rosie in the end emerges as a strong character, but so for much of the early part of the narrative, she comes across as very, very passive. I mean, I'm sort of, or do you disagree with that, or did you intend her to be so passive? You know, you do sometimes sit there and think, just tell him to fuck off. You know, I mean, she's so sort of desperate for his approval, and I found it quite hard to understand why sometimes.
I think that's a fair observation. Funnily enough, I was talking with another author who also wrote quite a passive character who gained steam throughout the book. And it's a tricky thing to write a passive character, because people they have expectations of a character's sense of agency and how characters should behave. But I would say that I think the main thing that I felt for Rosie was this idea of free will did not exist for her. And I think when you are someone who has suffered traumatic events as a child, that free will is taken away from you for quite a long time, because so much of what you do is a reaction. And Rosie was very isolated. She was incredibly naive. And so that sense of disconnection kind of led her to be passive, more than her passivity being a condition of her being, right? So and I also think that there's tremendous pressure put on characters to be all singing and dancing, and yet I think that most of us, if we look back on our youths, they were often large sections that were very passive from the exterior. But I get that it's hard. And it can be difficult as a reader to stick with it. I get your frustration. Yes.
Well, it's not necessarily frustration, but I was interested. But I'd like to know, for the people, there may be people watching this who haven't read the book. Perhaps you could just briefly give us a synopsis of how it goes with Bennett and Rosie, and without giving away. I would do it, but I don't want to give away spoilers. So perhaps you could just quickly explain to people what Rosie's story is, so that they can make sense of our conversation to some extent.
So Rosie is orphaned her parents die in a car crash, and she is raised by an unloving grandmother in a blue-collar area of Lowell in Massachusetts, which most of us who are regional know where that is. She gets a scholarship to study art, which she feels unworthy of, at Parsons School of Design in New York. And when she's there in New York, she meets, in the Museum of Modern Art one Sunday afternoon, she meets Bennett Kinney, who is 20 years older than her, and very charismatic and worldly. Bennett sort of makes a bead on her and whisks her away to this gorgeous estate on the Connecticut coastline, and sort of gives her entree into this very, very elite world, the WASP world, which we referenced earlier. But the reader cottons on sooner than Rosie that Bennett's actually a bit of a rake. And sure enough, they have to flee in the middle of the night for reasons that Rosie doesn't fully understand. And then they wash up at a farmhouse in rural Vermont that has no proper heating and is infested with mice. Bennett then sort of pretty much abandons her and their infant daughter, Miranda, while he goes off to teach at a college, a job that may or may not exist. And Bennett it moves in ellipses. He disappears and re-enters their lives. And Rosie gathers strength in those longer absences and dreads his return, which brings chaos. And then at a certain point, about 2/3 of the way through the book, Rosie ends up having to make a decision about whether she can move forward with him in their lives.
Great, that's perfect, Mel. You missed out a very important character called Billy, who's would it be correct to call her a trans man or a trans? I
think Billy is just I would say androgynous, really. Billy has chosen to shed her femininity. She's found it as something that is not useful to her, that has no meaning at all in the way she's chosen to live her life. And she first appears to be a man. And it's only after a few scenes that Rosie realizes that Billy is a woman. And Billy lives by herself with her dogs in a trailer, a very tough, resilient, and independent living.
So why have you chosen this paradigm? Is it to contrast with the passivity or initial passivity of Rosie? Do you see this as this kind of gender neutral presentation as being in some way a plausible escape for women who feel that they are in a patriarchal society?
Well, so it's kind of interesting. There was a review in Plowshares which sort of looked at this as kind of like my take on Orlando, like that there are all these different types of women throughout the book who've made different decisions about whether to be a man or whether to be a woman, or and I have to say I didn't write it that consciously, but I get that there was a subconscious element that was probably working on this. So initially Billy was a man, and then I just started to feel like the last thing that Rosie needs out in the boondocks is some guy who she has to negotiate with sexually or in some other way. Because if you're a young woman, anytime you have a relationship with a man, there's going to be this issue of sex. It's going to come up unless the man is gay or, you know, completely asexual. And I didn't want to introduce that element for Rosie or for Billy and that friendship. I wanted it to be something else entirely. So by making her not even a gay woman, but a woman who had just simply put this whole idea of gender aside, I felt it was liberating for Rose to see someone who had made that decision.
And there's certainly a sense in the book of the weight. Yeah, I would use the word patriarchy on women, and of sexual abuse throughout the book. or physical abuse or sexual abuse in some way. It's a very strong theme within the book. Now, I know that you've suffered abuse yourself, and I've asked you before this interview if you're prepared to talk about it, and I don't want you to go into details, but I do want to know how that makes the world look to you, that might be different from someone who hadn't suffered that abuse, and how you've used the book to try and express some of those concerns.
Well, thank you for asking that, Tim. We did talk about this. So I've often found that I can't write about a country until I've left it. You know, I found that I wrote most strongly about Tanzania when I was no longer living there. And in fact, my very first book, Away From You, I wrote it when I was no longer living in Kenya. And I waited a really long time to write about sexual abuse that I suffered as a child, because I didn't have objectivity about it. It was such a long shadow. I felt I couldn't really see it and see it in all the ways it impacted my life. So I really had to wait, and it was really only until I went through menopause, which kind of was like this bookend, it was the end of something. And when I got to the other side of menopause, I really felt I could look back and see what it had done to me as a woman. And I think that the biggest thing that I think is that, like Rosie, you know, abusers choose very isolated children, very isolated people. I mean, that's how it goes on for the length of time it does. A child is isolated in one way or another. And so, you know, that sense of isolation has this other side to it, which is that it also made me unbelievably resilient and independent and incredibly self-sufficient. I mean, I once had a friend describe me as like freakishly self-sufficient. So, you know, I think that part of Rosie comes out too. You know, she really gets it, and she takes care of herself, and she makes a life for herself. And I was proud of that part of me. But the damage part, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it really takes away your agency. It takes away your ability to make free will decisions, because you're reacting all the time to this founding event that was so damaging. I mean, you're damaged for so long. The men you choose to be with, I mean, I could have been with Bennett. I have been with men like Bennett. And not, you know, and what she does with Wheezy. I mean, some of these are actually incidents not scripted per minute by minute from my life, but certainly situations I found myself in that if I had been a healthier person, I wouldn't have gone near someone like Bennett. There's a reason why he's with her, because he's damaged goods himself. So, you know, I think that, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so people like Bennett and Wheezy and every other man in the book, do you have some sympathy for them?
Well, you know, I think it's a fair cop that every man in the book is a jerk. Although there is Nick, and I do want to talk about Nick. So, I think part of the problem, and again, I'm talking, here I am, I think, well, part of the problem of being a survivor of abuse is that you choose really bad people. You choose really bad men. And so it would be unlikely that Rosie would make good decisions. So of course she attracts people like Bennett. Of course she doesn't tell Hobie where he can stick his $400. And, you know, even Wheezy, she kind of sleepwalks into that relationship. But actually, I do have sympathy for Bennett. I think Bennett is brilliant. I think he's funny. I think that he loves books. I think that Bennett is one of those people that if life had been different, he could have been an amazing person. But he devolves. So as Rosie evolves, he gradually loses speed. He loses all the youthful enthusiasm and beauty that were enough to kind of make him a character, and he falls off the rails. Towards the end of the book, you have Nick, who of course is the young man that Rose at that point works with at the egg farm. And she does have a relationship with Nick. He's much younger than her. He's 17. He is desperate not to become the asshole that his father is. And he sees that. And Rose is very caring of that. And I felt very protective of the character Nick, because I think that it's hard for young men when they see, you know, these terrible, you know, when you have someone like Trump as your president speaking and saying things, and you're a young man, how are you supposed to shape yourself in the world when those kind of people are modeling behavior for you?
So you see Nick's changing his gender identification because of Trump?
No. So Nick is the young guy at the end. He's the he works at the chicken ranch, right?
I might
He
be
works
getting,
at the
there's
egg
a
ranch.
character at the end who changes gender.
Yeah, but that's Chris.
Chris, sorry.
Yeah.
I beg your pardon.
Yeah. No, Nick is the young man. He's about 17 and he works at the chicken farm. And Rose has a soft spot for him because she sees that he's someone who's genuinely trying to be a good man and wants to be a good man, and yet is living in the shadow of his father, who's not. So, but yes, if you want to talk about Chris, the who does change gender, I don't know how much to reveal, but I'm assuming that most people have read the book.
Well, why did you? What was the function of Chris in the narrative?
Well, so again, Chris had been a man in the book, and honestly, I did just finish reading Orlando like a week ago, so I had to laugh about that parallel. Of course, I'm not Virginia Woolf. So Chris had, sorry. Yes, thank you, love. Oh, nice, lovely child, bringing me some tea. Oh, okay, Nancy, you haven't read the book. Well, I won't give too much away, but Chris had been a man, and I had an incident in my own life where someone I had worked with for a very long time called me up one day and said, well, I'm now a woman, and proceeded to send me pictures of herself in sexy clothes with big, enormous fake breasts, wearing little skimpy nighties. And this person was in their 60s, and I couldn't understand. Like, it wasn't just that this person wanted to become a woman, they wanted to somehow become some kind of 20-year-old pinup. And I became enraged, literally. I mean, not with the person, but enraged with this idea of this appropriation of what it meant to be a woman. Like, this is what you think a woman is? Someone with big boobs who wears sexy clothes? Like, how do you get in your head that that is what a woman should be? So I went through a whole process of trying to understand this particular relationship and why this particular person had gone on her journey, and I did come to a very different resolution with that I think is much more in line with the one that, thank you,
Done my reading and my piano.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I'm just starting my studying.
Thank you, well done. They're like this all the time.
Crazy.
They also do dishes and the laundry, and they make dinner, and they never argue. It's amazing. So without giving too much away, Tim, that whole section of the book does come from a very personal experience. Yes.
And that's very interesting about how a man might represent himself as a woman, and you were kind of horrified about what he thought a woman was. What is a woman, Mel?
You know, Tim, I was thinking about this a lot, and I was actually thinking about it in terms of your books, and the characters you tend to write about, which are really kind of average men. You know, they're not these sort of swaggering Saul Bellow, you know, characters, sort of, you know, John Updike. Um, your characters are sort of every man, and they struggle with that same thing of how do you be a man? Like, what is masculinity? What is it to be a man? And I think that's really what Rosie is struggling for. And maybe for me, hitting menopause was an opportunity to really kind of try and understand, what does it mean to be a woman in the society, particularly because I have these two daughters who are 11, and they're about to be launched into this world where they're no longer children but women. And how do I want to help them see that? So I think it's an ongoing discussion. How do I see myself as a woman? You know, Tucker Carlson the other night managed to use the word feminine as if it was some kind of slur. I mean, we live in a society that is still deeply hostile to the idea of femininity and feminism.
To be fair, Mel, I think you would also come across some feminists who would call the word femininity as a kind of slur, as in performed femininity, if you see what I mean.
As in what? Performed femininity,
as opposed to femaleness, you know, if you see what I mean.
Possibly. I mean, I think you can come across any kind of feminist that you want, but feminism itself doesn't demonize the feminine or femininity. You know, I think a
1950s housewife might.
Yeah, I think that's a trope thing to say that feminists all want to be butch and not be feminine. I mean, I think of myself as feminine.
I'm not going to remark on that, because whatever I say is going to go down badly. I'm going to read a little bit of your book, if that's all right, because I thought that some of the people would like to hear a brief extract. And I'm just going to read a bit that, as a man, I found exciting, because it's just got violence in it, and hunting, and these are the sort of things that men like. So this is Billy going on a hunt with Rosie, on a deer hunt, I think, yeah, about halfway through the book. The truck bumped along across the rough field behind Billy's, the lumpy residue of a summer's goldenrod, bramble, milkweed, and tussock grass. Billy tucked the vehicle under a cluster of wild apples and pines and cut the engine. There was to be no talking, and as Rosie waited in the dark, she came to learn about the quality of sound, not the cluster of noises or the background rattling that she'd always taken to be sound, but the single note of a squirrel's feet pattering across the leaf litter, or a car passing on Wilder Hill Road several miles away. Her ears seemed to vibrate. Tiny hairs within the coiled interior stiffened with the anticipation of listening. An owl, an unidentified snuffling. Rosie entered a different dimension. Then she heard the gentle pinprick step of hooves in damp grass. She heard the fabric of Billy's coat rustle, but she could see nothing. The moonless dark was absolute. And then a wild blast of white light illuminating the salt lick, and a doe as Billy flared the truck's headlamps. The deer slowly raised her head. She did not seem the least alarmed, looked directly into the light, so her eyes gleamed blood red. In the peripheral light, Rosie watched Billy shift out of the car, leaning her rifle on the open window of the open door. Her finger slid to the trigger. For a moment, Rosie wanted to shout to the animal or to yell at Billy to stop. But already the bullet had left the chamber. Already the doe was dropping, knees first, and canting to the side. Billy put her rifle up to the deer's eye, but it did not blink. When she lifted the doe onto the back of Billy's truck and back at the house, Billy slit open the belly and garlands of intestines slipped smoothly out. Well, this is your great talent, I think, Mel. Your ability to describe is amazing, and particularly nature, which you have clearly a very powerful connection with. And you see there in that scene the sheer violence of nature. I mean, if we include human beings as part of nature, and certainly it's nature red in tooth and claw, whether it's a human hunter or another kind of hunter. And I'm wondering how that allies in a way with male violence, because we see violence in nature everywhere. It's a self-eating organism, you could almost say. Is that something that men are just playing out in some strange way? That there's somehow programmed for violence?
I don't know, Tim. That's a profound question. And I can only answer personally. I think that mostly for humans, we use the word violence with the idea that there's choice behind it, right? Animals are not violent. Animals just do what they need to survive. And we are very definitely part of that. I think we have created this extraordinary idea that somehow we are not part of that same continuum of life and death. And we do everything possible to remove ourselves from it. But if you see, a wolf killing a deer, you are wrong to call it violent, because there's purpose, right? I think of violence as being something that we use almost with flair, right? As a kind of amusement. It's not necessary. It's not necessary to hurt things before we kill them and eat them, but we do. So I would say that was violent. Do I think that men are more violent than women? Actually, no, I don't. I just think that men, because they have more power, they therefore have more excuse to be violent. And I don't know whether that's a chicken or an egg, like, men became more violent because they have more power, or because men have more power, they became more violent. Women are certainly capable of incredible violence.
So
what do you think? What do you think?
Well, I think there's a pleasure in violence, which is why it's so popular. Either the way it's acted out, or the way it's viewed on a cinema screen,
Mm-hmm.
and the way people enjoy the spectacle of violence. I think it has a flavour, a taste for people.
I think it's interesting because as a completely different aside, I'm working on a script at the minute with my husband that's really looking at how people see Serengeti and why they want to go and see animals being hunted, hunting each other, and why, if you look at all the films about Serengeti, they feature this gruesome crossing where the wildebeest all die falling off this cliff into the water and eaten by crocodiles. I mean, people are lining up to look at this spectacle, and these animals are suffering. They're having the most horrific deaths, and slow deaths, drowning, breaking their legs, mothers being separated from calves. And there's all these tourist cars lined up to watch it, cameras clicking away. So I think it's a really interesting point. Like, why are people, like, what do we think we're getting out of that? Are we glad that we're not part of it? Is that what we're experiencing? I don't know. I mean, I'm halfway through the script, so I don't really have an answer for that. But I think it's definitely something we need to think about, is why are we so obsessed with watching violence?
Would you have pulled your car up to have a look?
Well, I mean, of course, having been married to a wildlife filmmaker, I've certainly seen my share of death in the wild. I think it's a very hard thing to see. it's a very hard thing to see an animal dying. You know,
Yes, I
but
remember talking to a guide on one of the safaris who was saying that a lot of people, like as you've just said, want to see a kill. It's the kind of ultimate experience. But after they've seen it, they kind of wish they hadn't, you know, because it disturbs them so much.
well, I think also what we are experiencing when we go to a place like Serengeti is, of course, that's where we've come from. You know, so maybe we're just trying to remind ourselves how we're not part of that anymore. We're above that now.
Right.
So I'm just, Tim, I'm looking at the time, and I know that you and I can kind of gas on for hours. But I didn't know whether Rachel and Duffy had any questions they wanted to put it out there to the audience.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really engaging and fascinating so far, and I could certainly hear y'all keep going on. But we do have a couple of questions at least in the chat, and if anyone has any more, please go ahead and type them in. The first one here, it is from Scott. He says, Melanie, I'm always curious about an author's process. Can you give us a sense of how you step into a story? What's your starting point?
Well, Scott, I'm kind of a newspaper junkie. So I love our local newspaper, the Caledonia Record. And I often find kind of little stories in there that fascinate me. And so I can't quite remember which was the story, the specific story that got me going on this, but there was one about and it didn't end up having anything to do with this story, but it was about a moose that had been shot out of season and dragged behind a truck. And these two young guys had obviously shot it and didn't realize they couldn't get it into the back of the truck because it was too heavy. And then they tried to drag it, and then the whole thing fell apart behind the truck. And so they abandoned it. And eventually there was public outcry. And I was sort of fascinated by the idea of characters who just get caught doing something just really bad. And so that, I know that doesn't make sense particularly for this book, but I'm always interested with this idea of good people who get caught doing bad things or somehow find themselves caught up in a bad situation, doing something that is seen as bad. And then in terms of process, I just come up with a general outline of a story, and then I start writing. But I tend to be a huge rewriter. So my first draft is nearly always a disaster. It's a mess, and then I write out from there. Post-its all over the walls, just constantly revising and revising and revising. And I know that Tim has a different process. Tim, will you talk quickly about your process? Because Tim is a fantastic structuralist.
Well, no, it's not so different actually, Mel. I mean, I'm like you, bash out the first draft as quickly as possible. It's usually pretty terrible. And then I spend an awful lot of time rewriting. I'm quite chaotic. I stop and start, but I don't have post-it notes. I have computer files in which I have lots of thoughts going on. But I think there's nothing like a universal answer to that, because every novelist I've ever spoken to seems to do it in a different way. But anybody who's thinking of writing, I would very, very, very much commend Mel's method, which is just move forward, just keep going, and you'll get, at the end of a first draft, you'll have something that vaguely resembles a bad novel, but it's better than nothing, and then you can write something that's just a bad novel, and then eventually you can write an okay novel, and who knows, if you keep going long enough, you'll write a novel that's good enough for someone else to read.
I think that was what, my first book I wrote, Away From You, I got to the end of the first draft, and I remember exactly where I was sitting reading it, and I just wept because it was so awful. I couldn't believe I'd invested everything, like so much passion and time, and it was just awful. And now when I read my first draft, I'm prepared for the fact it's going to be horrible. And so, now that I'm about to start my fifth book, I sort of brace myself for the horror that the first draft is going to be. So I think you definitely develop a sense of your own process, which does make each successive book just that much easier. I mean, it's never easy, but at least you kind of know yourself as you go into it.
Yeah, you learn to forgive yourself, don't you?
Yeah.
To some extent, instead of hit yourself with imaginary sticks about it not being good enough. And also on process, one thing I would add is that I don't look at newspapers. I just find something in my head that bugs me and I want to explore, and that won't leave me alone. So, it's always an idea for me, a theme, you might say, and the theme is always, in a sense, it's always the same theme, I suppose, which is how do we live our lives?
Mm-hmm.
How do we and how should we?
So there's another audience question asking, which authors do you most admire and why?
Oh dear, this is always a difficult one. I feel like I should always have some kind of ready answer, because it always seems to depend so much on what I've got on my nightstand. I think one of my favorite books, and again, I feel like a traitor to my gender, but one of my favorite books is Madame Bovary, of course, written by a man. And I just am so, no, you have to wait. Just give me 5 minutes. I have to, luckily it's not the horse colicking. There's nothing wrong with the animals. There's no panic in the background. But I think that what I loved so much about that book is this depiction of a woman who is completely trapped by her gender, and the incredible sensitivity that he has towards this woman. Like, she's horrible, but you completely understand that she's a product of her time. So, and then just other writers, gosh, I don't know. I feel like, The Power and the Glory, Graham Greene, like, that's just such an incredible book. And I feel like I'm dating myself horribly by giving those two examples. So Tim, what about you?
Interesting. I'm quite literally doing a tribute act in my books at the moment to John Updike. It's Rabbit Stories, which are really the story of every man in Middle America. And ever since I read those, I wanted to sort of do the same for an English everyman. And that's exactly what I've been doing, is writing the story of someone as they grow from 30 to 50 over 3 volumes. And so Updike, though I went back and reread him the other day, and although all the insight and brilliance is there, I was quite shocked at some of his misogyny and racism, which I kind of didn't really get the first time I read it 20 years ago. And it really shows up now. And you can really see, same with Roth in some way. You can really
there was a big article in The Guardian just today about reviewing Philip Roth's biography, and what a hideous misogynist he was in his books, is sort of exposing his wives and lovers, in a brutal way. It's sort of cloaked as fiction, and sort of putting them out there as to be laughed at or sneered at. I mean, it was.
I don't think he hated anyone quite as much as his central characters, though.
Yeah.
I mean, the narrator was always the most hateful character, whether it's Portnoy or Zuckerman. So it's all a matter of self. He's quite democratic with his hatred, but I mean, he's yet again though an amazing writer. But like Graham Greene and like Flaubert of his time, and time has moved so quickly, that we can't, as writers, we have to try and keep up. And it's not always easy to do, especially at the pace of social change and mores at the moment. So it's hardly surprising when you go back to these great writers, you see how flawed they were, but that doesn't you know, I'm not going to judge them from the perspective of 25 years later, you know, and say I'm so much better than you were, you know, because they were speaking the voice of their time and generation and gender. And
Well, I mean, even me, when I look back at Away From You, it feels, my first book in 2000, it feels horribly dated. So yeah, it changes very quickly. So
I believe we are just about out of time, and I know, Melanie, you've got, sounds like you've got some demands upon your time as well. But I thought, just as one last question, we've heard on Northshire Live about, from a lot of different authors who have had the pandemic has no impact on their writing, and it just exactly stays the same, or those who are just completely crippled, even though the act of writing is a really solitary thing. How has, you know, our reality affected both of y'all's writing habits?
I got a lot done. I've loved it, actually. I mean, it's not really that much different from my normal writing life. And now I can get the schadenfreude of knowing that everyone else is having to suffer what I have to suffer every day. It's a very ungenerous emotion. But in the same way, it does make me feel better about my life, that I'm not sitting alone in a room all day. Mel, what about you?
well, I think that it's true. Like, I don't think the pandemic has, like, we live in a pandemic. We live in a room in our heads, wearing comfortable clothing, you know, with a flask of tea on the desk. Like, that is just what we do. So I think I do miss, and it sounds so weird, I miss those early weeks of the pandemic when it was just suddenly so quiet and nobody went anywhere and everybody stayed home and there were no cars and there were no planes in the sky. There was a stillness that stopped ambition. I think the tricky part about being a writer is that you do have this ambition. You're always fighting with this ambitious side of that you want your book to be a success and you want to be a success and you want to be recognized. And it's so antipathetic to the way that you naturally live your life. And when that pandemic hit, that ambitious piece was completely switched off. And it was an incredible relief for me.
It was lovely. I mean, it was a tragedy and all, but you know, it was lovely too.
Yeah, you were just isolated weirdos, basically.
Totally fed up with it.
Yeah.
Well, Melanie, Tim, this has been such a good evening. The book is The Hare. You can order it from Northshire Bookstore. Rachel just stuck another link in the chat. Please order it from us, or if you've not ordered it, if you've already ordered it, please, that's great. This has been a wonderful afternoon event. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Duffy. Thank you, Rachel. And I really wish that Tim's books were available here because he is, you know, he is one of my favorite authors. So.
That's very sweet.
Oh, we tried to get him. We really did. I called it a favor to our book buyer, and it says
the American literary world is
sorry about that. Well, everyone have a great day or
All right.
evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.